There is a version of World War I that most people know. It exists in bronze statues and folded flags, and the phrase "never again" carved into granite that no one reads anymore. It lives in sepia photographs of young men standing straight in wool uniforms, their expressions serious in the way people were serious in photographs before the war taught them a different kind of serious. That version of the war has a shape. It has a beginning and a middle and a technical end. It has named battles and famous poets and a date in November when the guns stopped. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. It is incomplete in the way that a medical report is incomplete when it lists the cause of death, but leaves out everything that happened to the body in the years before. The version most people know is the outline of the war. What follows is closer to the interior. World War I was not a war that began with passion and ended with exhaustion. It was a war that began with administration and ended with more administration. The killing was systematic. The dying was processed. The suffering was catalogued, filed, sometimes lost in transit, and occasionally stamped with the word normal in the margins of documents that no one was meant to read twice. The men who fought it were not heroes in the classical sense, and they were not monsters in any useful sense. They were workers in an industry that had no product except attrition. They clocked in. They waited. They advanced or they didn't. They were counted. The ones who survived were counted again. The ones who didn't were replaced, usually within the week, by men who had been waiting in columns somewhere behind the line. Columns so long and so orderly that they looked from the air like supply convoys, which in a functional sense is exactly what they were. What follows is a careful account of 22 behaviors, practices, and institutional norms that the machinery of World War I produced and sustained. These were not aberrations. They were not the result of individual cruelty or isolated command failures. They were the logical outputs of systems that had been constructed, rationalized, and in most cases legally protected. They were considered normal, not because the people involved had lost their moral sense, but because the systems they operated within had already decided what normal meant before any individual arrived to consent or object. The first thing to understand is that the smell was administrative. This is not a metaphor. Across the Western Front, the dead were present in such numbers and for such duration that their decomposition became a logistical variable. Commanders factored it into morale assessments. Medical officers noted it in weekly reports. The presence of unburied bodies in no man's land was not an emergency. It was a condition. It had a name in field documentation. It was listed alongside mud depth and wire density and the availability of rations. In the early months of the war, there had been improvised burial parties and informal truces, and a general assumption, inherited from previous wars, that the dead would be collected and marked, and given something recognizable as a funeral. That assumption did not survive contact with the scale of what was happening. By 1915, it had been replaced by a different assumption, one that was never stated in official orders, but that structured everything around it. The assumption was that some of the dead could not be recovered and that this was acceptable. Men who had been in the same trench as their friends on Monday would be within 30 meters of those friends on Friday and would not be permitted, would not even think to request permission to cross the open ground and retrieve what remained. The bodies became part of the landscape. Soldiers learned to navigate by them. They learned which sections of trench wall concealed skeletal remains and which sections were only reinforced with sandbags. They learned not to dig in certain places. This knowledge was passed between units during relief rotations as practical information, the same way men passed information about where the snipers were active and which sections of duckboard had rotted through. The presence of the dead was a working condition, and working conditions were adapted to, and that adaptation was called normal. The second behavior grew directly from the first. Soldiers ate their meals within feet of decomposing human bodies, and did so without comment or apparent distress. This is not a statement about callousness. It is a statement about neurological and psychological adaptation under sustained conditions. The olfactory system, The system that processes smell has a well-documented capacity to habituate. Prolonged exposure to a constant stimulus reduces the brain's conscious registration of that stimulus. This is a biological fact, not a moral judgment. What matters for this account is what it meant institutionally. It meant that the conditions which would have constituted a health emergency and a humanitarian crisis and an immediate command priority in any other context were, in the trenches, simply present. They were present in the way that noise is present near a factory. They were present in the way that darkness is present in a room without windows. Soldiers wrote letters home. They described the food, which was often poor. They described the weather, which was often terrible. They described their friends. They did not, in most cases, describe the smell, because by the time they were writing the letters, they had been in the trenches long enough that the smell had stopped registering as an event worth reporting. This absence in the letters is itself a document. It records the precise point at which the unbearable became unremarkable. The third behavior was the routine exposure of men to artillery bombardment of a duration and intensity that had no precedent in human history. The largest bombardments of the war lasted for days. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 was preceded by a 7-day bombardment of the German lines, during which the British fired approximately 1.5 million shells. The men on both sides of that bombardment experienced acoustic and concussive exposure that the human nervous system was never designed to sustain. The sound was not loud in the way that ordinary sounds are loud. It was a physical presence. It moved through the body. It disrupted organ function. It caused immediate hearing damage that was often permanent. It caused what soldiers and officers described as a kind of vibration in the thinking, a difficulty concentrating, a feeling that the thoughts had been physically rearranged. It caused uncontrollable trembling, loss of bladder and bowel control, inability to speak, temporary blindness, and in some cases complete psychological dissociation, a state in which the individual was present and breathing and responding to basic commands, but was, in some functional sense, no longer there. These symptoms were observed, noted, and in most cases not treated in any meaningful way. The men who displayed them were returned to their positions as quickly as possible. The logic was straightforward and was never seriously questioned at the level of high command. If a man could stand, and if he could hold a rifle, and if he could be placed in a line with other men who could stand and hold rifles, he was a functional unit. The question of what the sustained bombardment was doing to the interior of that unit was not a question that the system had a mechanism for processing, and so it was not processed. The fourth behavior was the formalization of that silence into a diagnostic category. Shell shock was not initially recognized as a medical condition by the British military establishment. The men who presented its symptoms were assessed through the existing frameworks of military medicine, which had been built around physical injury. A man who could not walk because his leg had been destroyed by shrapnel had an injury. A man who could not walk because prolonged artillery exposure had severed the connection between his conscious will and his motor function had, in the initial assessment of the medical authorities, a problem of character. The word used most frequently in early medical reports was hysteria, borrowed from a 19th century psychiatric framework that had been applied almost exclusively to women. The application of a female diagnostic category to male soldiers was not considered offensive or absurd. It was considered accurate because the only available framework for understanding a man whose body refused to obey him was a framework that located the failure in the man rather than in the conditions that had produced the failure. The men who could not stop shaking were described in medical documents as lacking moral fiber. The men who could not speak were described as willfully mute. The men who had dissociated entirely, who sat in aid stations and stared at the middle distance and did not respond to their names, were in some cases charged with cowardice, a military offense that in the British Army carried the death penalty. The administrative machinery that produced these diagnoses was operating correctly within its own parameters. The parameters were simply wrong, and no one with the authority to change them was interested in changing them, because changing them would have required acknowledging that the war itself was producing the damage. and that acknowledgement would have had operational consequences that the command structure was not prepared to accept. The fifth behavior was the execution of men who were mentally incapacitated by the very conditions their commanders had ordered them to endure. During World War I, the British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers for offences that included desertion, cowardice, and sleeping at post. A significant proportion of these men had documented medical histories that would today be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, acute dissociative episodes, or other psychiatric injuries directly caused by combat exposure. The executions were conducted at dawn. They were administered by firing squads composed of other soldiers from the condemned man's own unit, because military doctrine held that the act of execution should be witnessed and in some cases participated in by the men the execution was meant to deter. The soldiers who made up the firing squad were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were selected by their officers, and they were ordered to perform the function, and they performed it. And their performance of it was noted in unit records as a routine administrative event. And they returned to their positions, and the war continued, and no one in any official capacity asked what the experience of shooting one of your own soldiers did to the men who had been ordered to do the shooting. That question was not within the scope of any available form. The sixth behavior was the deliberate concealment of casualty figures from both the public and from many levels of the military command structure itself. The scale of death in World War I was so far outside any prior European military experience that its accurate communication would have constituted, in the assessment of the governments involved, a threat to the war effort. The British government operated a system of press censorship from the beginning of the conflict. The Defence of the Realm Act, passed in August 1914, gave the government sweeping powers to suppress information it deemed harmful to the national interest. Casualty figures were managed, delayed, underreported, and in some cases, actively falsified. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons had died. They were not told how many other sons had died on the same day, in the same operation, for the same number of yards of ground. The aggregate picture was kept from the population because the aggregate picture, if it had been accurately understood, would have revealed that the operations producing these casualties were not achieving their stated objectives. This was not a secret kept by a few cynical individuals. It was a bureaucratic function performed by departments, offices, and agencies employing hundreds of people, most of whom believed they were doing the right thing, most of whom went home in the evenings and ate dinner and slept and came back in the morning to continue not telling the truth about how many people were dying. The seventh behavior was the continuation of operations that had already demonstrably failed, on the grounds that continuation was strategically necessary. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, resulted in approximately 57,000 British casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. This was the single largest loss in the history of the British Army, accomplished in a single day against defensive positions that the preceding 7-day bombardment had failed to destroy as intended. The planned bombardment had been designed on the assumption that the shells would cut the German barbed wire and destroy the German defensive positions and stun or kill the German soldiers waiting in their dugouts. It did not do these things with sufficient consistency. The German dugouts, which had been constructed to a depth that British intelligence had underestimated, protected a large proportion of their occupants. When the bombardment stopped and the British soldiers climbed out of their own trenches and began walking across no man's land, as ordered, the German soldiers climbed out of their dugouts and manned their machine guns, as trained. The result was predictable to anyone who had processed the available information. The command structure had not, in any meaningful operational sense, processed the available information. The attack continued for 4 more months. The battle ended in November 1916, with total casualties on all sides exceeding 1 million. The territorial gain for the Allies was approximately 12 kilometers at the deepest point of the advance. This was recorded in official histories as a strategic success because the alternative recording would have required a different accounting of the decisions that produced it. The eighth behavior was the use of poison gas as a standard operational tool, normalized through bureaucratic language to the point where its deployment was discussed in the same register as artillery preparation or supply logistics. Germany deployed chlorine gas for the first time in a large-scale offensive context in April 1915 at the Second Battle of Ypres. The effect on the Allied soldiers who encountered it was total physiological collapse. Chlorine gas destroys the lungs. The men who breathed it in sufficient concentration drowned in their own fluids, a process that took between 4 and 48 hours, depending on exposure level and individual physiology. The soldiers who saw the yellow-green cloud approaching and did not understand what it was stood their positions, because standing their positions was what they had been trained to do. The ones who ran were often captured or killed in other ways. The experience of the gas attack at Ypres was reported by survivors in terms that had no precedent in military language, because the thing that had happened to them had no precedent in military experience. Within months, all major powers on the Western Front had developed gas programs. Within a year, the deployment of various chemical agents, including phosgene, diphosgene, and eventually mustard gas, was a standard feature of major operations. Mustard gas was particularly effective because it did not kill quickly. It caused severe chemical burns to the skin, the eyes, and the respiratory tract. It incapacitated men for weeks or months, which in logistical terms was often more damaging to the enemy's operational capacity than outright killing, because a dead soldier requires only burial, while a blinded and burned soldier requires medical personnel, supplies, transport, and institutional attention. Gas casualties were categorized, routed, processed, and in many cases returned to the front after recovery. The men who had been gassed and had recovered sufficiently to stand and hold a rifle were functional units. The system had a use for functional units. The ninth behavior was the normalization of lice and the parasitic diseases they carried as simply a permanent feature of frontline existence. Every soldier on the Western Front was infested. This was not a matter of individual hygiene failure. The conditions of trench warfare made infestation inevitable and made any sustained effort at elimination practically impossible. The lice lived in the seams of clothing. Soldiers spent portions of their rest periods running candle flames along these seams, listening for the small crackle of individual lice being burned, a process they called chatting. The chatting reduced the population temporarily. It did not solve the problem. Louse-borne relapsing fever and a condition called trench fever, caused by the bacterium Bartonella quintana, were endemic throughout the war. Trench fever caused severe recurring fever, bone pain, and debilitating weakness. It was not immediately fatal in most cases, but it was chronic and it was present at all times, in all units. Medical authorities understood the vector by 1918. The solution, delousing stations where men could bathe and have their clothing treated, was available and was used. It was not sufficient to eliminate the problem because the rate of reinfestation upon return to the trenches exceeded the rate of reduction achieved at the delousing stations. The lice were a managed condition, like the mud and the wire, and managing them meant accepting their presence and adjusting operational assessments accordingly, and this adjustment was considered standard medical administration. The 10th behavior was the systematic underprovision of food as a managed condition rather than an emergency. Frontline soldiers on all sides experienced chronic nutritional deficiency throughout extended periods of the war. Supply chains were disrupted by artillery, by the condition of roads, by the structural difficulty of moving material forward through active or recent combat zones, and by institutional allocation failures at multiple levels. British soldiers in the trenches subsisted for extended periods on bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and tea. French soldiers experienced severe provisioning crises at multiple points. German soldiers, subject to the British naval blockade that restricted the import of food to Germany, experienced progressive nutritional deterioration over the course of the war, with civilian populations experiencing genuine famine conditions by 1917 and 1918. The caloric and nutritional content of frontline rations was calculated by supply authorities and was generally understood to be below what sustained physical exertion in cold and wet conditions required. This was known. It was documented. It was not resolved, because resolving it would have required either reducing the operational demands placed on the men or significantly increasing the logistical capacity devoted to feeding them. Neither option was straightforwardly available, and so the shortfall was absorbed into the operating parameters, and the men were hungry, and the hunger was noted in medical assessments as a contributing factor to reduced performance, which contributed to higher casualty rates, which reduced the number of men who needed to be fed, which is a kind of resolution, though not the kind that anyone stated in writing. The 11th behavior was the performance of regular attacks against fortified positions known in advance to be extremely unlikely to succeed, because the alternative to attacking was a strategic stasis that the command culture had decided was unacceptable. The logic of the Western Front was attrition. Both sides had constructed defensive systems of extraordinary depth and sophistication. Attacking these systems directly, which is what the front required, produced casualties at rates that in any other context would have constituted the end of the operation. The command culture on both sides had developed a response to this, which was to reconceptualize the purpose of the attack. If an attack could not be expected to achieve a territorial breakthrough, it could be redescribed as an effort to drain the enemy's reserves, to force the enemy to expend men and material in defending ground, to wear the enemy down over time through the accumulation of losses. This reframing was sincere in the sense that the generals who articulated it believed it. It was also convenient in the sense that it made any offensive operation defensible regardless of its immediate tactical result. An attack that failed to take its objective and resulted in 10,000 casualties was not a failure. It was an attrition exercise. The enemy had lost some number of men defending the position. Those men would not be available for future operations. The ratio of losses would be assessed, and if the ratio was favorable, the operation was considered to have been worth conducting. The men who had been killed were entered into the ratio, and then they were entered into casualty returns, and then they were entered into the replacement calculations, and the replacements were moved forward, and the next operation was planned. The 12th behavior was the assignment of men to the same lethal positions repeatedly, with no mechanism for rotating them out of the most dangerous sectors, except injury, death, or the end of the war. The system of reliefs, in which frontline units were periodically rotated back to rest billets, did exist, and was used. It did not solve the fundamental problem, which was that the men who were rotated back were rotated forward again after a period that was generally between 4 and 8 days, depending on available replacements and operational requirements. Men who had survived multiple tours of frontline duty, men who had been through major engagements and had remained physically intact, were returned to the front because they were experienced and because they were available. The system had no institutional mechanism for recognizing that a man who had been under sustained combat conditions for a year or 2 years was not the same as a man who had arrived fresh from training, not in any way that the system could process or respond to. He was present, he was counted, he was assigned. This was not cruelty. It was the operation of a system that had defined its variables in a particular way and that produced outputs consistent with those definitions. The 13th behavior was the practice of field punishment, in which soldiers convicted of military offenses were physically restrained, often tied to fixed objects in positions of stress, exposed to whatever conditions existed in their location, and kept in this state for specified periods as both punishment and deterrent. Field punishment number 1, as it was formally designated in the British Army, involved tying the convicted soldier to a fixed object, often a gun wheel or a post, for up to 2 hours per day during a period of up to 3 months. This was done in the open. It was done in rain and cold. It was done within sight of other soldiers. It was done while artillery might be active in the area. The men subjected to this punishment had committed offenses that ranged from serious dereliction, to remarkably minor failures of discipline. The punishment was legal, documented, and considered a proportionate and appropriate military response to the maintenance of order in a fighting force. The men who carried it out were following regulations. The men who observed it understood its function. It was a tool of institutional control, and it was used as such with complete bureaucratic regularity. The 14th behavior was the widespread cultivation and use of alcohol as a managed coping mechanism at every level of the military hierarchy, including the official issue of rum to frontline soldiers before and after major operations. The British Army issued a rum ration as a standard provision during the war. This was not a concession to weakness. It was a logistical decision made by people who understood, at some level, what the men were being asked to endure, and who recognized that a degree of chemical alleviation of that condition was compatible with the maintenance of operational capacity. Officers drank more extensively because officers had access to more. Alcohol was present in aid stations, in rear area billets, in officers' messes, and in the informal economies of the front. Men drank before attacks when they could. They drank after attacks when material was available. The drinking was not considered a problem by the institutional framework unless it produced a degree of incapacity that registered as an operational issue. The man who drank enough to steady his hands before climbing out of the trench was self-medicating in a way that the institution understood and accommodated. The man who drank enough to fall asleep on sentry duty was a disciplinary case. The line between these two conditions was managed through institutional judgment rather than consistent principle. The 15th behavior was the performance of medical triage on a scale, and with an efficiency that required the systematic withholding of treatment from men who were assessed as either too seriously wounded to benefit from available resources or too lightly wounded to require immediate attention, while men in the middle category received what care was available. This triage system, which is still used in mass casualty medicine today, was developed and refined during World War I, largely because there was no alternative. The casualty volumes on the major battlefields of the Western Front exceeded by enormous margins the capacity of the available medical infrastructure. Clearing stations behind the lines received wounded in numbers that made individual assessment a luxury. Men with abdominal wounds, which required complex surgical intervention of the kind that was not available in field conditions, were frequently set aside in the dying category, given morphine, and left. Men who had lost limbs but whose vital signs were stable were assessed as salvageable and were processed towards surgical care. Men who had minor wounds were given initial treatment and returned toward the line. The men in the dying category who did not die immediately, who remained conscious and aware and able to speak, were in a position that the medical system had categorized and had no further institutional response to. They had been assessed. They had been assigned. The assignment was dying. What happened in the time between the assignment and the completion of the process was not within the scope of the available forms. The 16th behavior was the construction and maintenance of extensive military cemeteries as an ongoing operational activity, run with the same administrative regularity as supply depots or communication networks. The Imperial War Graves Commission, established in 1917, was a bureaucratic organization created specifically to manage the dead on an industrial scale. It employed surveyors, registration officers, gardeners, stonemasons, and administrators. It developed standardized grave markers. It created protocols for the identification of remains, which were followed with varying success depending on the condition of the remains and the quality of records. It established procedures for the notification of next of kin that were designed to manage the flow of information in a way that could be absorbed by the postal and administrative systems of the home country. The construction of cemeteries in the active war zone, sometimes within artillery range, was a continuous activity throughout the war. Graves registration units followed the advances and retreats of the front, marking and recording as they went. This was considered essential administration. The dead required management. The management required personnel, equipment, and institutional structure. The structure existed, and it functioned, and its functioning was one of the things that made the continuation of the war operationally possible. because without it, the accumulation of unprocessed dead would have eventually exceeded the system's capacity to continue treating death as a manageable variable rather than a fundamental problem. The 17th behavior was the use of underage soldiers in frontline combat roles, a practice that was both documented and extensively ignored by the command structures of all major belligerents. The minimum enlistment age in the British Army was 18, with 19 as the minimum for overseas service. The actual ages of men and boys in British frontline units included a documented population of soldiers who were 15 and 16 years old. They had enlisted by misrepresenting their ages, which required no particular sophistication, as the enlistment process did not verify age claims against any external record. Recruiting officers in the early years of the war, when voluntary recruitment was the primary mechanism of force generation, operated under pressure to meet quotas, and questions of age verification were not consistently prioritized against the pressure to process recruits. Boys who arrived presenting as adult were often assessed as adult. The parents who discovered that their underage sons had enlisted and who contacted the War Office to request their return were sometimes successful and sometimes not, depending on whether the son had already been deployed overseas, whether the unit could identify him, and whether the military machinery had the administrative capacity and willingness to locate and discharge him. Boys who died before this process could be completed died as soldiers. They were recorded as soldiers. Their ages, when known, were recorded accurately on their grave markers, which is how it became possible to count them afterward. The 18th behavior was the routine practice of officers issuing orders for attacks that those same officers privately assessed as unlikely to succeed, because the alternative to issuing those orders would have been an act of insubordination that the military legal framework treated as a capital offence. The culture of the British Officer Corps, and to varying degrees the Officer Corps of all major combatants, required the transmission of orders downward through the chain of command without modification or visible doubt. An officer who received an order to lead his men across open ground toward a fortified position, and who believed that this order would result in the deaths of most or all of those men, was expected to convey that order to his men, to lead the advance personally, and to conduct himself with sufficient visible confidence that his men would follow him into the ground that was going to kill them. This expectation was not considered extraordinary. It was considered the fundamental requirement of military leadership. The diaries and letters of British officers, many of which were censored at the time and some of which were not published until decades after the war, contain accounts of men lying awake the night before attacks they expected to die in, writing letters to their families, putting their personal effects in order, and then in the morning standing up and going forward, and in many cases dying exactly as they had expected. The system required this of them, and they performed it, and the system continued. The 19th behavior was the gradual erasure, through institutional practice and enforced language, of the individual identity of the soldier in favor of his function as a unit within a larger operational calculation. This erasure was not total, and it was not consciously intended as such by most of the individuals who contributed to it. It was a product of scale. When you are managing a force of several million men, administrative coherence requires that those men be represented in documents, planning processes, and resource allocations as units of a particular type. An infantry private is a unit with certain characteristics. He requires a certain quantity of rations, ammunition, and medical resources. He produces a certain statistical probability of performing certain functions at certain levels of effectiveness under certain conditions. He can be planned around. He can be allocated. He can be replaced. The language that the military machine used to describe its personnel was not cruel language. It was technical language, and technical language tends toward the abstraction of the objects it describes. When military documents describe the consumption of infantry in a particular operation, they were using the word consumption accurately, in the sense of a resource being used up in the performance of a function. The men who were consumed had names, histories, families, particular fears and hopes and habits of thought. These were not administratively relevant. What was administratively relevant was their classification, their availability, and their replacement timeline. The 20th behavior was the construction and operation of systems for managing what soldiers witnessed and thought about and communicated, systems of censorship that were not merely governmental, but internal to the military unit itself. Letters written by soldiers were subject to censorship by their officers before dispatch. The officer would read the letter and remove, physically cut or ink over, any content that was deemed to be prohibited under the censorship guidelines. Prohibited content included information about locations, unit strengths, and operational details. It also included content that expressed too clearly the psychological condition of the writer, content that described in too much detail the realities of what was happening in the trenches, and content that could be described as calculated to undermine morale or spread disaffection, a category that in practice covered a wide range of honest description. The soldiers who were writing these letters knew they would be read. Many of them adapted their writing accordingly, developing a kind of code, an understated elliptical style in which the horror was implied rather than stated, in which the gaps between sentences contained the things that could not be written. The officers who read the letters were often men who were themselves living in the same conditions, censoring descriptions of experiences they were simultaneously undergoing. This was the system, and they were part of it, and they performed their function within it. The 21st behavior was the use of propaganda, both domestic and directed at enemy troops, that bore so little relationship to the realities of the front that it constituted, for those with direct experience of those realities, a kind of institutional gaslighting. Posters in Britain depicted the war as a noble and successful enterprise. Newspaper reports, subject to the censorship already described, presented battles as victories when they had produced catastrophic casualties and minimal territorial gain. Official photographers were deployed to the front with instructions to capture images that conveyed the appropriate impression of military effectiveness and controlled adversity rather than the physical and psychological conditions as they actually existed. The soldiers who returned from the front on leave, who traveled through cities that were full of recruiting posters and newspaper headlines, and well-meaning civilians who had been informed of a different war than the one the soldiers had been fighting, experienced a dissonance that many of them described as the most disorientating feature of leave. The war at home and the war at the front were so different in their depicted character that communication between the two worlds became structurally difficult. Soldiers stopped trying to explain. The civilians stopped trying to ask questions that they sensed they did not want the answers to. The system had successfully partitioned its populations, and both populations adapted to the partition. And the partition was considered a functional outcome by the administrative bodies that had produced it. The 22nd behavior was the continuation of the war for more than 4 years, in the full knowledge of those with access to the operational data that the stated objectives were not being achieved on the timelines or in the manner projected by any of the planning documents that had justified the original commitment of forces. This is not a conspiracy claim. It is a claim about institutional momentum, about the way systems of sufficient scale and complexity develop a self-sustaining logic that makes continuation more thinkable than revision. The governments that had entered the war had made commitments, had issued orders, had constructed economies and social systems around the war's prosecution, had imposed conscription, had censored dissent, had executed deserters, had processed millions of casualties, had paid millions of pounds and francs and marks, had made official statements about war aims that could not now be acknowledged as unachievable without invalidating the entire accumulation of cost that had been incurred in pursuing them. The cost justified further cost, because acknowledging that the previous cost had been disproportionate to what it had achieved would have required a reckoning that no institution in 1916 or 1917 was constituted to perform. So the plans were made and the orders were issued and the men were moved forward and the casualties were taken and the returns were filed and the replacements were allocated and the cemeteries were extended and the triage was performed and the letters were censored. and the newspapers were managed, and the gas was deployed, and the executions were scheduled, and the artillery was prepared, and the attacks were ordered, and the dead were counted, and the plans were revised, and the orders were issued. Again, the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. It took effect at 11 in the morning. In the hours between its signing and its taking effect, both sides continued military operations at or near normal intensity. The guns continued to fire. Men continued to advance and to be killed. Commanders who had received official notification that the war would end at 11 o'clock issued orders for morning operations that would conclude before that hour, because the operational logic that had been running for 4 years had not yet received a signal it knew how to process. In those final hours, between the signing and the silence, more men died than had died on many single days earlier in the war. They died in the ordinary way, by the ordinary mechanisms, recorded in the ordinary returns. They were assigned to the replacement calculations, and then they were not replaced because there was no longer a requirement for replacements. The last recorded Allied soldier killed in action on the Western Front died at 10:58 in the morning on November 11th, 1918. His name was George Edwin Ellison. He was a British private from Leeds. He was 39 years old. He had survived the entire war and was killed at 10:58, and the guns stopped at 11, and his death was recorded in a document that was then filed in an archive where it remained for decades before researchers found it. The paperwork was in order.